The following graph gives information about the rainforest distribution in South America. According to this graph, the largest part of rainforest is in Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, Suriname, which is tropical rainforest, colored with light green. We can also see a narrow, long stretch of tropical rainforest lying along the eastern coast of South America, next to Atlantic Ocean. And another stretch is located along the northwest coast of South America, next to Pacific Ocean. We see temperate rainforests in Chile, the southmost area of South America, colored with dark green. In conclusion, this is an informative map. The following graph gives information about how the fruits grapes come to customers. According to the graph, the first step is purple grapes ripening on the vine, followed by the second step, in which the grapes are loaded onto a truck and transported. After that, the third step is the grapes conveyed on a conveyor belt, followed by the fourth step, in which the grapes are stowed into a brown paper box as its package. The final step is the grapes loaded in a cart, which means the grapes reach customers. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about different species upper limbs. The items include human arm, seal limb, bird wing, and bat wing. You can see from this graph that, in human, hand, wrist and fingers are smaller than those in seal limb. You can see from this graph that, in bird wing, radius and ulna are thin and short. You can see from this graph that, in bat wing, humerus is thinner than that in seal limb. You can see from this graph that, in bat wing, there is a wing membrane connecting fingers. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about a food chain. It shows how the process is done. The items include bees, small fish, bear, and a tree. You can see from this graph that the first step is bees feeding on flowers of the tree. You can see from this graph that the second step is small fish feeding on bees. You can see from this graph that the third step is a bear feeding on fish and a fish skeleton remaining. You can see from this graph that the next step is the dead bear decaying into a skeleton. The final step is dead bear nourishing the tree. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about a fruit and vegetable market. The items include market stalls, products, traders, and customers. You can see from this graph that there are bunches of bananas, which are yellow and piled next to green grapes on the stall. You can see from this graph that there is a woman standing in front of the stall, who is buying some green vegetables, with a black plastic bag on the left arm. You can see from this graph that there are many basins, which are red and blue, and put on the electronic balances. It's a beautiful picture, and it shows a lot of things. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about students' hours spent at the university. The items include sleeping, leisure, and sports, grooming and so on. According to this graph, the value of sleeping is around 8.3 hours, and that of leisure and sports is lower, which is around 3.9 hours. You can see from this graph that the highest value is sleeping, which is around 8.3 hours. You can also see from this graph that the lowest value is grooming, which is around 0.8 hours. In conclusion, sleeping has the highest number of students' hours spent at university. The following graph gives information about the average household energy consumption. The items include other appliances, water heating, cooking and so on. According to this graph, the proportion of other appliances is around 24%, and that of water heating is lower, which is around 23%. You can see from this graph that the highest proportion is other appliances, which is around 24%. You can also see from this graph that the lowest proportion is cooking and standby, which is around 5%. In conclusion, other appliances have the highest proportion of average household energy consumption. The following graph gives information about instant coffee. It shows how the process is done. The items include adding coffee beans, adding sugar, and stirring. You can see from this graph that the first step is adding coffee beans to a cup with a spoon and a tray. You can see from this graph that the second step is adding sugar from a sugar pack. You can see from this graph that the third step is stirring the beans and sugar with the spoon. You can see from this graph that the next step is adding boiling water to the cup with a kettle. The final step is the instant coffee completed. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about percentage of students from disadvantaged backgrounds entering university in England. The items include years and student percentages. You can see from this graph that the value of 2007 is around 12%. You can see from this graph that the value of 2008 is around 13%, which is higher. You can see from this graph that the value of 2014 is around 18, which is the highest. You can see from this graph that the value of 2006 is around 11%, which is the lowest. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The line chart shows the projected population in Australia in millions. According to the chart, the Series A has increased dramatically from 20 in 2001 to 65 in 2101. Following that, Series B has increased moderately from 20 to 45, from 2001 to 2101. However, Series C has increased slowly from 20 to 35 over the same period. In conclusion, the projected population in Australia is expected to increase in the coming years. The following graph gives information about temperature of Beijing, China. The items include daily high and daily low throughout the year. You can see from this graph that, in daily high, the value of January is around 1 degree centigrade. You can see from this graph that, in daily high, the value of July is around 30 degrees centigrade, which is the highest. You can see from this graph that, in daily low, the value of July is around 22 degrees centigrade, which is lower. You can see from this graph that, in daily low, the value of December is around -10 degrees centigrade, which is the lowest. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. This picture shows the pyramid of food. At the bottom of the pyramid, we can see water, which is the most essential to human bodies. Above water, on the second layer of the pyramid, we can see fruits, bread, and cereals. Above the fruits, bread, and cereals, there is a milk, cheese, and meat level. Above the milk products and meat, we can see junk food, which at the top of the pyramid. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about minimal ice thickness guidelines. The items include an adult, a kid, a car and a truck. You can see from this graph that, in the kid, the value of ice thickness is around 4 inches. You can see from this graph that, in the sled, the value of ice thickness is around 5 to 7 inches, which is higher. You can see from this graph that, in the green truck, the value of ice thickness is around 12 to 15 inches, which is the highest. You can also see from this graph that, in the adult, the value of ice thickness is around 0, which is the lowest. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about water cycle in nature. It shows how the process is done. The items include evaporation, transportation, precipitation, and runoff. You can see from this graph that the first step is water vapor rising from the blue sea. You can see from this graph that the second step is the vapor growing into clouds in the skies. You can see from this graph that the third step is clouds transported into mountainous areas raining or snowing. You can see from this graph that the next step is precipitation turning into runoff on the ground. The final step is the runoff converging back into the sea. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about how a ship lock works. It shows how the process is done. The items include a ship lock, a ship, dams, and pipes under the bottom. You can see from this graph that the first step is that the upstream gate opens, and the ship goes into the lock. You can see from this graph that the second step is that the upstream gate closes and the water level evens. You can see from this graph that the third step is that the downstream gate opens, and the ship moves out of the lock. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about Internet users who accessed via mobile phone. The items include 16 to 24, 55 to 64, and 65 plus. You can see from this graph that, in 45 to 54, the value is around 32%. You can see from this graph that, in 35 to 44, the value is around 50, which is higher. You can see from this graph that, in 16 to 24, the value is around 70%, which is the highest. You can also see from this graph that, in 65 plus, the value is around 8%, which is the lowest. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about renewable energy. The items include heating and cooling, transport, and power. You can see from this graph that there are two thermometers in heating and cooling, which is 51% with 10% renewable energy in it. You can see from this graph that there are a ship and a plane in transport, which is 32 with 3% renewable energy in it. You can see from this graph that there is a plug-in power, which is 17 with 26 renewable energies in it. You can see from this graph that there is an arrow below power, which means an increase of the share of renewable energy. It's a beautiful picture, and it shows a lot of things. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about different types of recycling. The items include thermal recycling, chemical recycling, and material recycling. You can see from this graph that, in recycling, the value is around 1.85 million tons. You can see from this graph that, in material recycling, the value is around 2 million tons, which is higher. You can see from this graph that, in thermal recycling, the value is around 5.2 million tons, which is the highest. You can also see from this graph that, in chemical recycling, the value is around 0.38 million tons, which is the lowest. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about compositions of air. The items include oxygen, nitrogen, and other gases. You can see from this graph that, in oxygen, the value is around 20%. You can see from this graph that, in other gases, the value is around 1%, which is lower. You can see from this graph that, in nitrogen, the value is around 79%, which is the highest. You can also see from this graph that, in oxygen, the color is pink. And other gases include carbon dioxide, argon, and water vapor. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about how tomatoes come to consumers. The steps include a tomato tree, transportation, filtering, packaging. According to this graph, the first step is the tomato tree, which grows many tomatoes on the branches. According to this graph, the second step is to transport tomatoes by a blue truck. You can see from this graph that the third step is to filter bad tomatoes out on a conveyor belt, followed by a crate full of good tomatoes as the fourth step. The final step is to fill the shopping cart with the good tomatoes for consumers. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about plastic bottle recycling. The steps include new bottles, refilling, used bottles and plastic processing, and, according to this graph, the first step is newly produced bottles, which are empty. According to this graph, the second step is to fill the empty bottles with beverage. You can see from this graph that the third step is to open the bottles and drink up it, followed by the fourth step is to transport used bottles back to the factory and use them as materials. The final step is the plastic materials turn into new bottles waiting for refilling. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about hospitalizations for schizophrenia in general hospitals by age group. The age groups range from 1 year to 90 years old. According to this graph, in 15 to 19, the value of females is around 30, and that of males is higher, which is around 75. You can see from this graph that the highest value of females is in 35 to 39, which is 120. You can also see from this graph that the highest value of males is in the same age group, which is 180. In conclusion, hospitalizations vary with different age groups. The following graph gives information about fast food consumption by meal. The items include breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack. According to this graph, in breakfast, the value is around 22.7%, and that of snack is lower, which is around 22.6%. You can see from this graph that the highest value of lunch is 43.7. You can also see from this graph that the second highest value of dinner is 42%. In conclusion, fast food consumption has 4 kinds. The following graph gives information about fast food times a week. The items include every day, once a week, and never. According to this graph, in several times a week, the value of July 2003 is around 17%, and that of 2013 is lower, which is around 16%. You can see from this graph that the highest value of December 2006 is in about once a week, around 33%. You can also see from this graph that the lowest value of July 2013 is in every day, around 3%. In conclusion, Americans usually eat fast food. The following graph gives information about average weekly household expenditure. According to this graph, the items include food, medical, transport, and holidays. You can see from this graph that the value of food is 123. And the value of medical care is 50. The value of transport is 124. According to this graph, the value of holiday is 33. As you can also see that the value of housing is 164. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about Europe. Positions of different countries are displayed on the map. At the central area, there are Austria, Germany, Poland, and Czechia. In the left area, there are Ireland and Portugal. According to this graph, the largest country is Russia, which is located on the right side. In comparison, small countries include Denmark and Belgium. In conclusion, there are many European countries shown on the map. The following graph gives information about percentages by age and sex. The items include age groups, female and male. According to this graph, in male, the value of 85 plus is around 0.7, and that of 75 to 84 is higher, which is around 3. You can see from this graph that the highest value of female is in 25 to 34, which is 16.5. You can also see from this graph that the value of less than 4 is 7.8. In conclusion, 85 plus has the lowest percentage of population in female. The following graph gives information about life expectancy from 1960 to 2015. The items include male, female and all. You can see from this graph that the value of male in 1985 is around 56. You can see from this graph that the value of male in 1970 is around 54, which is lower. You can see from this graph that the value of female in 1991 is around 66, which is the highest. You can see from this graph that the value of all in 2005 is around 50, which is the lowest. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about New Zealand house price. The items include New Zealand and OECD. The horizontal axis is year, ranging from 1990 to 2014. According to this graph, in 1990, the value of New Zealand is around 100, and that of OECD is almost the same. According to this graph, the highest value of New Zealand is 250, which is in 2007. According to this graph, the value of New Zealand is higher than OECD. In conclusion, OECD has smaller changes. The following graph gives information about average tax rates for the highest income taxpayers in 1945 to 2009. The items include top 0.01% and top 0.1%. You can see from this graph that the value of top 0.1% in 1950 is around 42. You can see from this graph that the value of top 0.1% in 1990 is around 25, which is lower. You can see from this graph that the value of top 0.01% in 1945 is around 60, which is the highest. You can see from this graph that the value of top 0.01% in 2005 is around 21, which is the lowest. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about consumption of fast food by Australian teenagers. The items include pizza, fish, and chips. You can see from this graph that the value of fish and chips in 1995 is around 50. You can see from this graph that the value of pizza in 1985 is around 30, which is lower. You can see from this graph that the value of hamburgers in 2000 is around 100, which is the highest. You can see from this graph that the value of pizza in 1975 is around 5, which is the lowest. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about pounds of chocolate consumed per capita in countries each year. The items include Switzerland, Germany, Ireland, Norway, etc. According to this graph, in Sweden, the value is 11.9, and that of Australia is lower, which is around 10.8. You can see from this graph that the highest value is in Switzerland, which is 19.8. You can also see from this graph that the lowest value is in France. In conclusion, Switzerland consumes more chocolate than any another county does. The following graph gives information about the view of a street in fog. This is a very beautiful picture, and it shows a number of things. According to this graph, at the central area, there are 3 bicycles ridden by women at the front. The color of them is black. You can see from this graph that, behind the bicycles, there is a thick blanket of fog covering a lot of people and street lights. The color of the fog is white. You can see from this graph that, at the background, there are 4 straight dashed lines on the road surface. The color of those is white. The weather is foggy. The sky is gray. In conclusion, this picture is very informative. The following graph gives information about working hours in Germany. The horizontal axis is year, ranging from 1970 to 2017. According to this graph, in the year of 1970, the value is around 1,900. And according to this graph, in the year of 1975, the value is around 1,800. The lowest value is around 1,300, which is in 2017. On the contrary, the second lowest value is 1,370, which is in 2010. In conclusion, if this trend continues, working hours will be lower in the future. The following graph gives information about a floor plan. Different rooms are displayed on the floor plan, including a living room, a kitchen, a water closet, and an entrance hall. In the upper left area, there is a living room with a set of green sofas at the lower right corner. In the upper right area, there is a kitchen, which has a rectangle table with 6 chairs. According to this graph, the largest area is the living room, which is next to the entrance hall. In comparison, the smallest area is the water closet next to the washroom. In conclusion, there are different functional areas shown on the map. The following graph gives information about a floor plan. Different rooms are displayed on the floor plan, including a living room, a kitchen, a water closet, and an entrance hall. In the upper left area, there is an open kitchen with a sink at the upper left corner. In the upper right area, there is a small study, which has a rectangle desk with a chair. According to this graph, the largest area is the living room and the dining room, where there are a table with 6 chairs and a set of sofas. In comparison, the smallest area is the water closet next to the stairs. In conclusion, there are different functional areas shown on the map. The following picture gives information about best food for brain health. According to the picture, there is a red brain on the left side, in which there is a lot of junk food. The junk food includes potato chips, popsicle, wine, and hamburger. There is a nearly empty battery below the red brain. There is a blue brain on the right side, in which there is a lot of healthy food. The healthy food includes vegetables and fruits. In conclusion, we should change bad habits and boost our brain power. The following floor plan provides information about an apartment layout. According to the picture, I can see a spacious living room with a sectional sofa and coffee table. From the picture, there is a king-sized bed, 2 nightstands, and a wardrobe in the master bedroom. Moreover, moving to the kitchen, I can see an island, sink, stove, refrigerator, and upper and lower cabinets. Lastly, I can see from the floor plan that the largest space is the living room, while the smallest space is the half bathroom. In conclusion, it is a very informative picture. The following picture gives information of a sakura tree. In the lower right corner, there is a thick tree trunk, on which some green leaves grow. From the trunk, a few branches stretch across the picture, one of which stretches to the upper left corner. From the picture we can see a lot of twigs stretching from those branches. On the twigs, there are a lot of sakura flowers in blossom, whose color is pink. On the background, we can see a blue, sunny sky. In conclusion, this picture is beautiful and informative. The following graph gives information about water cycle. According to the picture, I can see evaporation from the sea. From the graph, I can see transpiration from mountains. Moreover, I can see from the graph that water go back into the sea through rain and rainwater infiltrates into the soil. Lastly, there is a waterfall in the right side of the picture. In conclusion, the picture is very informative. The graph gives information about water cycle. According to the picture, I can see evaporation of water from the ocean, which is the first step. From the graph, there is condensation by absorbing water vapor, which is the second step. Moreover, I can see from the graph that the third step is precipitation. Lastly, I can see that water flows down the mountain into the soil. In conclusion, the picture is very informative. This picture gives information of food pyramid. We can see rice and water in the top of the pyramid. Below rice and water, there comes bread. Lower, we can see vegetables, including carrot and broccoli, and fruits, including orange and lemon. When it comes to the bottom of the pyramid, we can see milk, grape, ham, and cake. The pyramid is to say that people should eat as many kinds of food as possible to stay healthy. In conclusion, this picture is very informative. This picture gives information of the structure of the tree. We can see the outermost layer is leaves, which are green. All the leaves are on the twigs, according to the picture. Then all the twigs come from the branches shown in the picture. And all the branches come from the trunk of the tree. We can also see a lot of roots develop deep into the soil from the trunk. The tree grows in a lawn, where we can see a lot of other trees. In conclusion, this picture is very informative. This pie chart gives information about pet ownership by region. From the picture we can see for Asia the share is 15%. For Europe the share is higher, which is 25%. The highest share is for North America, which is 40%. And the lowest share is for Africa or Oceania, which is 5%. There is another continent, South America. In conclusion, this pie chart is very informative. This chart gives information about change in average weekly working hours by industry. From the picture we can see in technology the value of week 1 is 40. In healthcare the value of week 1 is higher, which is 45. The highest value of week 2 is in healthcare, which is 43. And the lowest value of change in hours is in healthcare, which is -2. There is another industry, education. In conclusion, this bar chart is very informative. The following picture gives information about the number of U.S. households keeping pets. From the bar chart, we can see the value of cats is 42.7 million. The value of dogs is higher, which is 63 million. From the bar chart, we can see the highest value is for total, which is 84.9 million. The lowest value is for horses and saltwater fish, which is 1.6 million. In the bar chart there are also other items, including freshwater fish and birds. In conclusion, this bar chart is very informative. The following line chart gives information about ownerships of cell phone and smartphone in the US. From the line chart we can see in 2005, about 62% of adults owned a cell phone. In 2010, about 35% of adults owned a smartphone, and 80% owned a cell phone. In 2020, about 80% owned a smartphone and 96% owned a cell phone. In conclusion, the gap between the ownerships of smartphone and cell phone is decreasing. The following map gives information about the distribution of harlequin ladybird in England. The red dots indicate positions of the birds in 2004, and the black dots indicate those in 2005. We can see in 2004 the birds mainly lived in the east part of England, near North Sea. We can also see the number of the birds decreased in 2005. And only a very small part of the birds lived inland. In conclusion, the map is very informative.